Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Sister Citizen by Melissa V. Harris Perry. We are on page 166 in chapter 4, Disaster. The first comprehensive treatment of the case appeared in the 2007 text, Until Proven Innocent, Political Correctness and the Shameful Injustices of the Duke Lacrosse Rape Case by Stuart Taylor Jr. and Casey Johnson. Taylor and Johnson explicate the ways that police, prosecutors, university officials, and press ignored facts, shunned procedure, and manufactured certainty about the Duke players' guilt. The authors argue that the impetus of these actions was racial political correctness that assumed the players were guilty not only of rape, but of racism. In denouncing this rush to judgment, they repeatedly used the words shame, shameful, and ashamed. By doing so, they signal more than a legal assessment of the case. They encourage us to focus as well on its ethical and emotional implications. The Duke case is a stark reminder that race and gender shaming as a result of misrecognition is not restricted to African American women. The most obvious public shame was reserved for the young white men of the lacrosse team. George Jennison, the father of a team member, wrote about the painful experience his family endured as a result of mischaracterization of his son as a racist and a rapist. He writes, quote, "This pain has often resulted from the characterizations of the young men on the team. All the members of the team were vilified and found immediately guilty by the press and many in the Duke community as well. This story lends itself to extreme depictions. The story of young rich white men raping a younger poor black mother was an easier sell than the complex truth." End quote. Here, Jennison is pointing to an experience not unlike Phyllis Montana LeBlanc's in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. As a Katrina victim, LeBlanc was denied fair treatment because many saw her through the crooked lens of racial and gender stereotypes. Here, the lacrosse player is denied fair treatment because he is perceived to be part of a historical legacy of white male sexual abusers of black women. Both are denied public recognition of their true selves, and both are shamed as a result. Yet it is deceptively reductive to stop with the simple equivalency, suggesting that at times black women are shamed by misrecognition, and other times white men suffer the same fate. In the months and years following the exoneration of the Duke players, Mangum's dishonesty became the basis for a campaign of personal and intellectual shaming of the black women faculty who led the social disaster narrative. Although this shaming was directed at individual faculty members, its goal was not personal, but political. Critics of the 88 Duke faculty members who named the case a social disaster capitalized on Mangum's dishonesty to make a public argument against affirmative action and against the study of race and gender in academic institutions. It is reasonable to argue that the personal or professional damage suffered by tenured faculty members is unimportant when compared to the massive, unwelcome, and undeserved shaming of the young men on the lacrosse team. The faculty members are, at worst, only second-order victims of this social disaster. My point is not to evoke sympathy for these faculty members who suffer public humiliation or personal embarrassment, but rather to draw attention to some of their experiences. The content of the public campaign against them is rooted in unspoken assumptions about African American women as inadequate producers of academic knowledge and beliefs about race and gender as illegitimate subjects of serious intellectual inquiry. Some commentators exploited the Duke lacrosse case to mount a public campaign against affirmative action policies and higher education hiring. Faculty members who study race and gender were the targets of an intellectual shame campaign that had meaningful political content. On August 3, 2007, Joseph Bellicosa, a former dean at the St. John's University Law School and former judge of the New York State Court of Appeals, published an editorial in New York Newsday titled, quote, "Duke faculty should be shunned by students," end quote. Bellicosa advocated a strategy of public shaming in response to the social disaster article. He wagged an accusatory finger at these faculty members, writing, quote, "Duke, and especially its 88, should have known better professors were responsible for aiding and abetting Nafong's crimes against his Duke student targets. The DA has had his day of reckoning for what he perpetuated. The 88 should too, end quote. It is important to pay attention to Bellicose's use of the legal discourse of, quote, aiding and abetting, end quote, and its implication that the professors were guilty of crimes against the student athletes. For Bellicosa, by evoking race and gender discourse, the Duke 88 were thereby poisoning public opinion toward the young men. His piece was widely reproduced on blogs and websites. Readers offered assessments of the faculty as, quote, tenured terrorists, end quote, and echoed Bellicosa's assessment that the professors were irresponsible, intemperate, and unqualified. Let's keep reading. Criticism of these professors went beyond a reaction to the content of their social disaster ad. Commentators who targeted these faculty also sought to discredit their larger academic projects and to cast doubt on the hiring practices that brought them to the university. On January 29th, 2007, the Weekly Standard published a scathing piece by Charlotte Allen called, quote, Duke's Tenured Vigilantes, end quote. Allen not only criticized faculty members for their involvement in the social disaster advertisement, she mocked their academic work as ridiculous, lacking rigor, and based in political rather than intellectual questions. She asserted that, quote, Duke University Press is the laughingstock of the publishing world, offering such titles as Appropriating Blackness, Performance and Politics of Authenticity, and An Archive of Feelings, Trauma, Sexuality, and Lesbian Public Cultures, end quote. And goes on to criticize the work of Professor Carla Holloway, whose indictment of racism, sexism, and class bias at Duke was published in an online feminist journal soon after the incident. Holloway argued that despite the legal outcomes of the case, the Duke incident had raised cultural and social issues that required some serious investigation. Allen decided Holloway's assertions using precisely the history to which Holloway was pointing. Allen derided Holloway's assertions using precisely the history to which Holloway was pointing. Quote, the meta-narrative they came up with was 3 parts Mandingo and 1 part Josephine Baker. Rich white plantation owners and their scions lusting after tawny-skinned beauties and concocting fantasies of their outside sexual appetite so as to rape, abuse, and prostitute them with impunity. It mattered little that all 3 accused lacrosse players hailed from the Northeast or that there have been few, if any, actual incidents of gang rapes of black women by wealthy white men during the last 40 years. Okay, I think a few things come to mind with the passages that we just read. One of them is maybe in a different format than would be expected. We hear about the dangers of police terrorism and mass incarceration in the sense that these lacrosse players, these men, these young white men were falsely accused and went through and basically criminalized and vilified. And that is something that happens all over this country on a daily basis, on a regular basis, because of the flaws that exist within the criminal justice system. I think that one of the things that's important about understanding that the system is flawed is understanding that it's not flawed in a simple way. It's not flawed in the sense that it's only black people who are affected by it or only poor people who are affected by it. It's flawed in the sense that anybody can fall prey to it. It's flawed in the sense that there are multiple people from different backgrounds and different demographics who sit inside of prisons and sit inside of jails and because of things that they did not do, because of crimes that they were accused of that they did not commit. And I think it's important that we always have a understanding of that when we criminalize or vilify somebody before we have the facts of a case or before we have the facts of a situation. And again, there are multiple there's no such thing as a black and white situation when it comes to things like this. There are always complexities. Sometimes the complexities are deeper than others. Okay, let's keep reading. Allen's skillful inversion of the history of sexual assault against black women suggests that discussing this history is nothing more than political axe grinding rather than scholarly invocation of connections between historical experiences of oppression and contemporary power dynamics. This rhetorical move cast into doubt the entire history of black women's physical and sexual subjugation simply because Crystal Mangum lied about the assault in March 2006. The image of Jezebel is used to shame both contemporary black feminist scholars and the historical women whose lives are their source material. Allen describes these professors as, quote, vigilantes, end quote, thereby linking them with the history of racially provoked mob violence that took the lives of hundreds of black men, women, and children during the decades following the Civil War. The metaphor is clear. Just as lynch mobs are the illegitimate, uninformed, violent enemies of the rule of law, so too are those professors an illegitimate and dangerous threat to orderly academic inquiry and discourse. Taylor and Johnson's Until Proven Innocent joins Allen's assessment of black feminist critical studies as laughable. They carefully trace the professional resumes and personal conduct of several outspoken faculty members who originally signed the social disaster advertisement. They casually deride these professors as, quote, diversity hires, end quote, who, quote, advance while doing comparatively little, end quote, and characterize them as bad citizens, not only unqualified, but ungrateful, unpatriotic, and dangerous to the impressionable students they teach. Quote, professors like Lubiano, Holloway, Chin, Deutsch, Houston, and others trained in the race, class, gender approach generally consider American society deeply flawed, with the majority and the powerful oppressing women, minorities, and the poor. For these faculty members, the lacrosse case was too tempting not to exploit, and they did not hesitate to vent their class hatred against their own students. End quote. Taylor and Johnson never attacked these professors based on their race or gender identity. In fact, they are equally virulent in their critique of white male professors like Peter Wood and William Chaff. Neither they nor most other public critics of the Duke 88 specifically claim that Lubiano, Holloway, or other black women are undeserving of their academic positions because they are black women. Instead, these critics attack race and gender as objects of study, and they deride the intellectual and political assumptions underlying such studies. For example, although Peter Wood is a white man, his academic career is defined by his commitment to research on race and American racism. William Schaff's distinguished career as an American historian is based on his research about and commitment to racial and gender equality. Thus, it is not the hiring of a black woman that wastes university resources. It is taking race and gender seriously as objects of academic inquiry. Taylor and Johnson decry as shameful an entire institutional structure at Duke, and by extension at other universities, that provides the resources, public space, authority, and academic freedom for these, quote, farcical, end quote, activist professors, end quote, to, quote, babble, end quote, about racism and sexism as they defend a dishonest, sexually unethical black woman. Quote, in the era of political correctness and craven university administrations, the charge of racism, unsubstantiated but accompanied by a few demonstrations and angry rhetorical perorations, suffices to paralyze a campus, to destroy a reputation, and to compel an administration into submission. End quote. Race is important even to the author's denunciation of Michael Nafong, whose overzealous prosecutorial impulses they link to his political ambition. Nafong was facing re-election in the predominantly black city of Durham, North Carolina. Taylor and Johnson, along with many other observers, point to this looming political campaign as the primary reason Nafong behaved so irresponsibly. Through the arrest and indictment of the Duke lacrosse players, he hoped to position himself as champion of Durham's black community and thereby handily win re-election as district attorney and possibly develop political capital for future campaigns. Even as they reserve their most virulent attacks for Nafong, a white man, Taylor and Johnson implicate the corrupting influence of black political power. Many of the seemingly neutral ethical critiques leveled by Taylor, Johnson, and others thus contain powerful racial implications. One of the things that stands out in the passages we just read is just the corruption and the lack of moral integrity that exists within people who are participants in the game of electoral politics. And I don't mean that as people who are constituents and who are casting votes. I think that all avenues and all facets of politics we must use to our advantage. And so I'm not here to decry electoral politics or decry people for voting. What I am here to say is, though, that far too often politicians from Republican parties or the Democratic Party are, or here even in Rockford Independent, are put on this pedestal or given this platform as if they will be some type of social saviors, as if they will be the ones who bring forth some type of big societal change. And the truth of the matter is these people are doing whatever it is to keep themselves elected, to get themselves reelected, or to get their political career to move on a fast track to whatever office they want to ultimately have. And so we cannot view these people as moral compasses. We cannot view these people. We must view these people as just a sign of the temperature or the climate in a certain area. And so instead of looking at the mayor of Rockford as somebody who's going to save Rockford, who's going to fix these societal issues that exist in Rockford, you should look at the mayor of Rockford and see what his belief system is, but see what the platform he's running on is, see what the things he's doing and executing on a daily basis is, and let that dictate how you understand the social climate of Rockford and how you must combat the issues that exist in Rockford. But you cannot look at him as somebody who is here to fix those things. These people are here to primarily, more than anything, get reelected again. And so we've seen repeated over and over, whether it be from Republicans or Democrats, progressives, liberals, conservatives, moderates, that neoliberals, neoconservatives, that people will do whatever is necessary to keep themselves in office and to keep themselves reelected. And so that's what stands out to me there is the corruption that exists within the politicians that are part of the systems of this country. Okay, let's continue reading. I am not a neutral observer of the Duke case. I earned my PhD at Duke in 1999. Faculty members who were part of the group of 88 taught several of the courses I took in graduate school. Professors Wahima Lubiano and William Schaaf were members of my dissertation committee. Because Duke is my alma mater, I followed the events of the case and its aftermath very closely. Having been trained as a Black feminist scholar by these academics, I am attached to the intellectual projects that came under attack from critics of the Duke 88. A basic assumption of Black feminist scholarship is that researchers need not be personally removed from the issues we investigate. Black feminist scholarship assumes that Black feminist scholarship assumes that experiential knowledge has equal weight with empirical evidence drawn from more traditional sources of social scientific and humanist research. This insistence on lived experience as a valid source of knowledge is precisely what is in dispute between the Duke 88 and their critics. The social disaster ad argued that the faculty had gained important insights about the case and its social and cultural meaning by listening to the testimonies of students. This epistemological claim was scorned as ridiculous when the weight of DNA evidence showed that Crystal Mangum was being dishonest about the sexual assault. These Black women professors, their students, and their faculty colleagues were told to be ashamed of ever believing their own experiences, beliefs, and feelings were valid. There is strong evidence to suggest that Black women bore the brunt of this shaming. Laura Smart Richmond and Charles Jocelyn are researchers who were conducting a study at Duke University on the physiological effects of race and stress when the lacrosse rape accusation rocked the campus. At the start of their study, these researchers hypothesized that race-related stressors have pernicious and meaningful psychological and physical effects on African Americans. They tested whether students reacted differently to being shown a video that heightened their sense of student identity, a basketball highlights film, or a video meant to heighten their racial identity, video clips of Martin Luther King Jr. After viewing one of the two videos, man, this cord, I'm trying to stop for this cord from making so much noise, but I ain't found a good way to make that happen yet. After viewing one of the two videos, students had to deliver a brief videotaped speech about a personal experience of discrimination. By forcing participants to give a speech that would be videotaped, the experiment was designed to create stress. Moreover, it was the sort of stress readily associated with shame because it implied that the participants were being viewed and judged. After this procedure, the researchers collected saliva from the participants and tested the samples for cortisol to determine if those who were prompted to think about discrimination felt more stressed when identifying as a student or when identifying as African American. This research has clear implications for the general theory of racial recognition and shame I presented in Chapter 3. Recall from that chapter that cortisol is one of the physiological responses to shame and is also implicated in a number of negative psychological and health outcomes. Thus, this study was well suited to examine how a sense of identity, we might even say a sense of citizenship within the Duke Nation, served either to protect Black students or to expose them to racial shame and its attendant physical production of cortisol. The research, useful even in its original design, became an extraordinary study of race, shame, and cortisol when Crystal Mangum made her rape allegations against members of the Duke lacrosse team approximately halfway through the researchers' data collection process. Suddenly, they found themselves observing a natural experiment. If racial stress affects cortisol levels, they were in a perfect position to observe the effects of a real-life rather than laboratory-created racial stressor. The results from this study are striking. The lacrosse case elicited significantly higher stress levels, as measured by cortisol production, among one group of study participants, Black women. To a significantly greater extent than the other participants, their bodies were carrying the stress and shame of the event. In the heady and difficult days of the lacrosse scandal, African American women bore a particular burden on Duke's campus. They experienced particularly high levels of stress and a heightened sense of alienation. Quote, such alterations in physiological processes and adrenocortical responses in particular, quote, such alterations in physiological processes and adrenocortical cortisol responses in particular, end quote, write Richmond and Jonason, quote, can have a negative impact on long-term health outcomes. Cortisol hyperactivity is related to increased susceptibility to infectious diseases, and chronic cortisol elevations under long-term stress conditions have been associated with depression, end quote. In the aftermath of the scandal, African American women at Duke University experienced a substantially heightened level of the corrosive, illness-producing stress hormone cortisol. In the introduction to this book, I claim that the story of Hurricane Katrina was written on the bodies of Black women. This study provides evidence that the lacrosse scandal was literally written on the bodies of Black women at Duke. This is indeed what a social disaster feels like for African American women. My goal in presenting the Duke case is not to exonerate the Duke 88, though they committed no crime, nor am I interested in condemning their critics, who made a number of important contributions to our understanding of a complicated case, or in adjudicating who is right by some standard of my own creation. I want to understand the processes of public discourse that emerged in this case and, in particular, how that discourse affected Black women. In the example of Hurricane Katrina, many Black women experienced shame as a result of misrecognition caused by their identity as, quote, refugees, end quote, from a presumably violent and poor city. In the Duke case, race and gender scholars are publicly shamed because their work is characterized as intellectually insufficient when it leads them to publicly support a Black woman who turns out to be dishonest. The class privilege of Duke professors compared to many Katrina survivors is obvious. But in each case, assumptions about race, gender, and Black women's identity are important elements framing the ways that they are recognized or misrecognized in the public sphere. Together, these two very different kinds of disasters reveal some of the many complicated ways that race and gender shaming occur within American political and social systems. And that brings us to the end of that section. And again, I think the important element here, and we see the sort of the rhythm that Melissa V. Harris Perry is writing these chapters in. Towards the end, she gives us some of the empirical data. I hope I'm using that term properly. Gives us some of the empirical data that exist around the psychological and physiological effects of shame and stereotypes and racism and sexism. And I think that, again, just as important as knowing of being able to articulate belief systems, just as important as being able to recall events and give social commentary to certain events in history, it is also important for us to have data and statistics and numbers that can speak about the experiences that Black people in this country go through. So we're going to finish. We're going to read one more section and finish up this episode, and then we will start on the next chapter tomorrow. All right, the next session is entitled Responding with Strength. Politics is not just about thinking, it is also about feeling. Emotions are an important part of how we engage our political world. Sometimes we imagine that citizens gather information about candidates, parties, and policies, and then use that information to make reasoned decisions about their choices in elections or their options for collective action. But this sterile rationality obscures the truth that our emotions are critical to our politics. Citizens form attachments to political parties long before they can articulate a policy rationale for their loyalties. Paralyzing fear or vengeful anger helps explain many foreign policy choices. Hopeful, inspired happiness can explain why people vote for some candidates. Compassion can encourage efforts toward global justice and social change. Shame, too, can affect who we are politically, telling us to avoid the public space or provoking us to rage. But African American politics is not entirely or even primarily a history of political withdrawal or irrational aggression. African Americans, and Black women in particular, have somehow found the emotional resources necessary for sustained resistance against inequality. Black women's activism reminds us that psychological theories are not deterministic and that even shame may motivate political action. Sorry, I lost my spot. Psychologist Janice Lindsay Hartz reminds us, quote, experiences of shame may support our commitment to a destructive social reality. Indeed, racism is often supported by this mechanism when minorities become ashamed of their racial or ethnic identity. At times, it may be healthier to work to change others' views of reality rather than to give in to shame and accept the status quo view of reality. Black women in America have resisted and challenged the shaming ideologies about them in both formal and informal ways. One of the most enduring symbols of this resistance is Sojourner Truth. Her insistence on being recognized as a woman pushed back against the 19th century ideology that portrayed Black women as animalistic, sexual beasts of burden, whose physical and reproductive labor could rightfully be harnessed to enrich slaveholders. Truth's 1851 speech at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, articulated a space for Black women in the country that sought to strip them of human dignity. Quote, nobody ever helps me out into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And aren't I a woman? I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And aren't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And aren't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen them most all sold off into slavery. And when I cried out with the mother's grief, none but Jesus heard. And ain't I a woman? And aren't I a woman? End quote. Truth defines Black womanhood as struggle and the overcoming of adversity, unlike white, quote, ladyhood, end quote, which is understood as a life of privilege and ease. She locates the source of her feminine identity in labor and survival. Charlotte, a 62-year-old African-American woman in my Chicago focus group, explains the difference between white and black women by saying that black women can make miraculous events occur with little help or resources. Quote, "You know how black women are. We know how to make do, honey. We do with what we don't have. A white woman might cry because her family got nothing to eat, but if we got a chicken outside and some rice in the cabinet, we are going to make a full meal out of that. White women, they don't know how to handle it. They don't know what to do," end quote. Like her orator foremother, this contemporary black woman is deeply attached to a self-definition rooted in strength. Phyllis Montana LeBlanc called on a self-image as strong to help her survive the terror of Hurricane Katrina. Quote, "I don't know if anyone who's ever experienced this before can imagine sitting and waiting for disaster to strike and not knowing if today is your last day alive. The pressure on my heart is so intense that I want to just crawl inside of a closet with earplugs and a blanket, close my eyes, and make it all just go away. I choose to hang on to who I am, a strong black woman," end quote. To protect against the shaming assault of race and gender stereotypes, many sisters retreat behind a sense of mythic strength, creating a collective self-image of imperviousness. In their struggle to stand upright in the crooked room, African American women have crafted a new frame of reference, the strong black woman. W.B. Du Bois wrote that the assumed contempt of others not only makes an individual feel bad, it requires the whole race to use, quote, dogged strength to keep from being torn asunder, end quote. African American women's use of dogged strength to keep from being torn asunder gives rise to the strong black woman. She, too, is part of African American women's repertoire of strategies for resisting shame, but the strength myth has emotional and political consequences of its own. That brings us to the end of chapter 4, Disaster.